A father left his newborn daughter with hydrocephalus deep in the heart of the woods, surrendering her fate to the mercy of the gods. Yet, what began as an act of cruelty became the start of a journey, one that would forever alter the course of the little girl's life in a remote village in the south of the Republic of Madagascar. The night was thick with silence, broken only by the rustling of wind through the tall palms and the occasional cry of nocturnal creatures. Paulo clutched his infant daughter closer, her small fragile form swaddled in a blanket, head heavy against his shoulder. Her breathing was shallow, her tiny hands limp. He cast a weary glance over his shoulder as he walked further into the dense forest, every step heavy with uncertainty, each pause filled with a dread that had begun gnawing at him weeks ago. Since her mother Shani's death during childbirth, Paulo had devoted himself to his daughter's care. Through grief haunted his every waking moment for 3 months. He watched over her, shushing her cries at night, whispering lullabies he'd learned as a child. But then something changed. Her head, once perfectly round, began to swell, and her skin pulled taut around the bulging veins beneath her eyes, once bright, grew listless, and her tiny body seemed to weaken with every passing day. He brought her to the village healer, his heart pounding with hope. "Please," he murmured, laying her down on the small weathered mat in the healer's hut. "Is there something you can do?" The healer glanced at the child, then at Paulo with a somber shake of his head. "This is not a child's illness, Paulo. It is something else." The words hung in the air, heavy, filling the space between them with an unspoken fear. As days passed and his daughter's condition worsened, Paulo became desperate. He was a man who had buried his wife and now found himself at the mercy of forces he couldn't understand. Facing the prospect of losing his daughter as well, his heart screamed at him to keep her close, to protect her. Yet the whisper of the village elders rang louder in his ears each day. "This is the work of spirits," they told him in hushed voices. "Paulo, take heed. She's touched by something beyond us. You must let the forest gods decide her fate." The elders' words, woven with age-old beliefs and fear, clung to Paulo's mind, swirling around like shadows. He found himself awake each night, watching his daughter struggle to breathe, her small chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. The fear twisted deeper with every breath she took. He thought of Shani's face, her eyes full of hope as she'd awaited their daughter's birth. She wouldn't want this suffering for her child, he told himself. And so as dawn broke one morning, Paulo steeled himself. He gathered his daughter, wrapped her tenderly in a blanket, and whispered an apology she would never hear. "Forgive me, my love," he murmured, his voice a choked whisper against her brow. "If this is the will of the gods, I cannot defy it." The village elders had instructed him carefully. 3 days, they said, nodding gravely. "Let's leave her in the forest near the village sacred mountain. If she is to live, she will. The spirits will see to it." Paulo stopped when he reached a small clearing, his breath hitching. This was the spot where the elders had told him to leave her. The wind stirred the trees, and the sky overhead was a dull slate gray. He knelt, his hands trembling as he placed his daughter on a soft bed of moss, her head resting unevenly, the once familiar weight now a twisted symbol of the unknown. Paulo felt the pull of every instinct within him to stay, to fight for her. Yet the words of the elders silenced that inner voice, numbing his senses. With an eerie calm, he took one last look at his daughter, her face small and pale against the green forest floor. Her eyes fluttered slightly, as if sensing his presence. "I'll return," he promised, though he wasn't sure if he'd return to find her alive or reclaimed by the forest's shadowy gods. The trees seemed to close in as he backed away, the sound of his steps muffled by the damp earth. With each step his resolve grew weaker, but he dared not look back. As he left, the forest grew quiet again, holding the child in a stillness only the ancient woods could know. The forest exhaled its early morning stillness, quiet but for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant calls of tropical birds. Victoria Graham, breathing in the cool dawn air, adjusted her backpack and looked over at her husband, Phillips Graham, who was engrossed in a conversation with their local guide, a tall man named Juma. The Grahams are famous pediatricians in the U.S., and they are on a volunteer trip to Madagascar. They had spent the past week working non-stop providing medical care to children in this village. Now, after 7 grueling days, the couple were finally on a brief respite, venturing deeper into the wilderness. "It's almost surreal out here," Victoria murmured as they tread forward, her eyes scanning the lush foliage. "Last night I kept waking up expecting a beeping monitor or a line of mothers waiting for meds." Phillips chuckled. "Can't blame you. I keep expecting Juma to hand me a list of patients," he replied, shaking his head. "But this break is overdue, even if it's just for one morning." Juma, overhearing, nodded in agreement. "You two have worked tirelessly. This forest is a place of renewal, a good change from all that chaos." The trio walked in comfortable silence, the forest floor damp underfoot, leaves crunching softly with each step. The volunteers, a mix of locals and a few foreign doctors, followed close behind, talking in low voices about the work they'd done that week. Some joked, others just walked quietly, basking in the silence that only a forest could offer. Suddenly, a soft whimpering noise broke through the ambient sounds of the forest. Victoria froze, raising her hand for the others to stop. Did anyone else hear that? She whispered, brow furrowing. Everyone fell silent, listening intently. There it was again, a faint cry, weak and almost swallowed by the forest itself. Phillips moved closer, following the sound. The cry grew louder as they approached a thicket of trees. There on the ground, nestled among fallen leaves and tangled roots, lay a small bundle wrapped in a threadbare cloth. Inside was a baby girl, her skin pale and gaunt, eyes barely opened. Victoria crouched down, her heart catching in her throat. Phillips, look at her head, she whispered. The child's head was enlarged, far too large for her tiny body, and beads of sweat dotted her brow. Despite the coolness of the forest floor, my God, Phillips breathed, kneeling beside his wife. She's severely malnourished, and it looks like hydrocephalus. He shook his head, scanning the child with practiced eyes. We need to get her to a hospital now. Victoria lifted the fragile child carefully, feeling how feather-light she was. The baby barely moved, her cries reduced to soft, shallow gasps. Juma looked on with a mixture of sadness and resignation, muttering something under his breath. Is there a hospital nearby that could handle this? Phillips asked, his voice tight with urgency. He knew the answer before Juma even spoke, but he needed to hear it from Dr. Graham. Juma replied, shaking his head. The nearest hospital has no equipment for this level of care. You would need a city clinic. But even then, Victoria and Phillips exchanged a glance. They were well aware of the grim medical infrastructure. Here she cradled the baby against her chest, feeling the faintest heartbeat. We have to make do, she murmured. The journey back to the village was swift, with Phillips already on his satellite phone contacting their American colleagues for assistance. Victoria tended to the baby as best as she could, cleaning her, wrapping her in the cleanest cloth they had, and checking her vitals every few minutes. By the time they reached the village, Phillips had arranged a call with a team back in the United States. Within hours, a temporary medical team arrived from the nearest major clinic, including American doctors who could set up a makeshift system to relieve some of the fluid pressure from the child's brain. Victoria and Phillips watched intently as the doctors worked, exchanging tense glances as each step unfolded. It was a delicate temporary solution, merely a way to buy time, but the child's condition continued to deteriorate, her breaths growing shallower as the hours passed. We can't wait any longer, Phillips said, finally, his jaw tight with resolve. We need to get her out of here and to a hospital with the right resources. Victoria nodded, determination set in her eyes. We'll do whatever it takes, she whispered, holding the child close. She didn't yet know the child's name, her origin, or her story, but Victoria could feel the fragile pulse of life beneath her fingers. It was all the motivation she needed. That night they made arrangements to take the child back to the United States, and as the plane lifted off the next morning, Victoria kept vigil over the small sleeping girl, vowing that no matter what, they would give her the fighting chance she deserved. The forest was still veiled in the thick pre-dawn mist. Paulo halted near a large rock, his eyes scanning the place he knew by heart, where the forest floor had been blanketed in her tiny blanket. Only now there was no sign of her, not a thread or even an imprint left in the soil. His heart sank as the realization set in. His daughter was truly gone. Sadness clung to him, a deep, relentless sorrow that weighed his shoulders down. But it was more than that. In the days after he left her, a quiet acceptance had also taken root within him, his wife taken by childbirth, and now his daughter swept away by forces beyond his control. It was the will of the gods, he told himself. These were not his decisions to make, they were simply his burdens to bear. With every step back toward the village, Paulo reminded himself, my daughter's spirit is safeguarded by those who dwell in a world we cannot see. She is at peace. Paulo kept his gaze on the ground as he returned, eyes dry but soul heavy, carrying an ache that would likely. He picked up the magazine, scanning the article that recounted the Graham family's discovery of an abandoned girl with an abnormally large head, thought to be cursed, left alone in the forest. His chest tightened as he read on, each word pressing heavier than the last. Hydrocephalus. It was not a curse, it was an illness, something medical, something that could have been treated if only he had understood. A sickness, not the work of evil spirits as he'd feared. Oh, Gabriel, he whispered, his voice breaking. An old wound he thought had scarred over ripped open, spilling out the regrets he'd long tried to bury. He could still see her tiny face as he laid her on that mossy ground, his heart clinging to the old beliefs, the only reality he'd known. But now, He saw his own cowardice and the weight of his ignorance. At that moment, Paulo's world tilted. He had believed he was doing the only thing he could, yet here she was, alive, thriving, a testament to the strength he had not possessed. He stumbled out of the crowd, hands shaking, nearly dropping the magazine. This was her, his daughter, the girl he had left behind in the forest all those years ago. He pressed his hands to his face, as if trying to hold back the realization clawing its way through his mind. This child dancing before him with such grace and confidence was the very same baby he had given up in desperation and fear. Memories of that fateful night flooded back the decision he made, the prayers he whispered as he walked away. He waited for the event to end, all the while haunted by the gap between him and the daughter he had never known. Summoning every ounce of courage, he approached Victoria and Phillips after the performance. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as he introduced himself. Victoria's expression changed, tightening with suspicion. She asked him questions, her voice steady but cautious, her eyes searching his face for answers. The Grahams stood across from a man they had hoped to never meet. He had the roughness of years etched into his face, a face worn and broken, yet eyes steady and desperate. "So you've come all this way," Phillips said, his voice low and steady as he studied the man standing before him. He tightened his grip on Victoria's hand, sensing her inner conflict. "To claim a daughter you left to die." The man, Paulo, nodded, his hands trembling slightly. "I know what it sounds like," he admitted, voice cracked and raw. "But in my heart, I believed it was a choice, a ritual that would save her soul. I was wrong, I see that now." He took a breath. Shoulders weighed down by a burden of regret that looked as if it would break him. "She's my blood, and I don't ask for forgiveness. I just want the chance to know her." Phillips's jaw clenched, his tone sharp. "You don't get to claim her now. Gabriel is safe, she's happy, and she's ours. The moment you left her there in that forest, you forfeited any claim." Paulo's face crumbled as he held back tears, but his gaze didn't waver. He stood his ground, trying to find the right words, but they escaped him, leaving only silence and the weight of past mistakes hanging in the air. Victoria looked down. Feeling a pang of empathy she tried hard to resist. She could sense the sincerity in Paulo's eyes, an unmistakable sorrow that softened her heart, despite everything she knew he had done. "Phillips," she began softly. But Phillips's grip tightened on her hand, his resolve unyielding. "No." Victoria, his voice was firm, his eyes cold as he met hers. "Gabriel doesn't need to know anything about this man's choices. He's a stranger to her. We won't disrupt her life for his convenience." Gabriel, unknowingly caught in the weight of adult secrets, had wandered close enough to hear bits of the exchange. She peered around the corner, curiosity in her eyes as she caught glimpses of a conversation laced with tension. She was too young to make sense of it, too innocent to recognize the battle lines being drawn over her future. Murmuring voices and hardened expressions left Gabriel puzzled, but she lingered, sensing something important brewing, something deep and unsettling in the words she didn't fully understand. Her heart, however, sensed the gravity of the moment, and she instinctively drew back, pressing herself against the wall, hoping to remain unseen. Paulo took a step forward, but Phillips's hand shot out, blocking his path. "You lost your right to call yourself her father," Phillips said, voice steeled with anger. "She's my daughter now, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect her from you, from the consequences of your ritual." Paulo's face fell, and he lowered his gaze, nodding slowly, as if coming to terms with a punishment he had long known he deserved. Victoria looked at the man, her heart a battlefield of empathy and loyalty. She could see the pain in Paulo's face, the regret that could never be erased. "Phillips," she said gently, "perhaps Gabriel should know someday, when she's old enough to understand." Phillips's response was instant, his voice cutting. "No, we're leaving this in the past for good." He looked Paulo squarely in the eyes. "We're going back to the States, and as far as Gabriel is concerned, you don't exist." Victoria glanced at Paulo, who stood in silence, bearing the weight of his past decisions, the life he could have been a part of, but was now forever denied. His lips pressed together, and he nodded slightly, words of protest unsaid, resigned to the consequences of his actions. As they turned to walk away, Victoria felt the ghost of guilt gnawing at her, but she clung to Phillips's arm. Gabriel, hidden from sight, watched as her parents moved away from the stranger, their conversation lost to the whisper of the trees. She sensed something was being left behind, something important and tangled with her own life, but she couldn't grasp it. The three of them returned to the safe cocoon of the life they had built, leaving the encounter behind like an unfinished chapter in an old unread story. The air in the Graham household was warm with laughter and the subtle aroma of the cake cooling in the kitchen. It was Gabriel's 15th birthday, and she knew it was going to be a special day. It was rare to have such a celebration for her, but Victoria insisted they go all out this year. Friends from ballet were arriving, and the living room was bright with sunlight and decorated with simple, elegant flowers. Gabriel twirled in her room, her new lavender dress swishing around her legs. Her reflection in the mirror caught her gaze. She paused and glanced down at her feet, perfectly positioned. It was second nature now, the ballet. And in this moment she felt a deep joy in her chest, an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The last few years had been intense, with endless rehearsals, performances, and lessons, but here she was, surrounded by people who loved her. "Gabriel, sweetheart, come downstairs." "Everyone's waiting," Victoria's voice echoed from the hallway. Gabriel grinned, adjusting her dress one last time before bounding down the stairs. The sight below filled her heart with a mix of joy and disbelief. There were her friends, her family, all gathered around the big table with a cake that seemed almost too beautiful to eat. Gabriel blew out the candles to the cheers and applause of the crowd. Later that evening, the guests were gone. The lights dimmed. She stood alone in the soft glow of the living room, her eyes drifting over the framed photos on the walls, moments captured throughout her childhood, each one carefully curated by Victoria. Her mother had always been diligent about details, preserving the memories they built together as if they were heirlooms. And yet, there was a quiet ache in Gabriel's heart that couldn't be silenced by the happy faces in those photographs. Victoria entered the room, her silhouette soft against the hallway light, carrying a small box. "I wanted to give you this when everything had quieted down," she said, offering a gentle smile. "Happy birthday, Gabriel." Gabriel took the box, her hands brushing against its smooth wooden surface. She glanced at her mother, 1,000 words forming on her tongue but refusing to coalesce into anything she could say. She opened the box slowly, revealing a delicate silver bracelet with a single charm, a small ballet shoe sparkling under the dim light. "It's beautiful," she murmured, fastening it around her wrist. But even as the charm glinted, her mind drifted back to a day they'd long since left behind back in Madagascar. She hadn't intended to think of it now, but the memory felt persistent, threading its way through the years and tugging at her thoughts. She looked up at her mother, her voice trembling. Can I ask you something?" Victoria, sensing something deeper in her tone, sat beside her, giving a warm, encouraging nod. "Anything, sweetheart." Gabriel swallowed, choosing her words carefully. "That time in Madagascar, I overheard something. You and Dad were talking to a man. He was angry. I didn't understand everything, but it sounded important. About me." She held her mother's gaze, her eyes searching for answers. A flicker of surprise crossed Victoria's face, softening into something deeper. She took a long breath, letting it out slowly. "Gabriel," she began, her voice hushed yet steady. "There's something we haven't told you, not because we didn't want to, but because we thought